Welcome, welcome. Good morning, everybody. Hello. Thank you for coming in this dreary weather. There's one panelist who isn't here because of the dreary weather. She's coming from New Orleans. She's in Chicago. We hope she'll make it here before we're done, but we don't know for sure. Well, I want to welcome you all to the Ebertfest academic panel on challenging stigma through the arts. Many arts are represented on our panel: directing, acting, video, teaching, writing, dancing, intellectual property law, a lot of areas. I should introduce myself. I'm Deborah Townsend. I'm a psychotherapist here in Champaign-Urbana. This is my 13th year as a member of the Champaign County Mental Health Board. Maybe that's why I'm here. I don't know. Longevity will out. I'd like to. Well, I can't.
Happens to a lot of us.
So it goes. I was going to quote Haskell Wexler, who was quoted in the paper yesterday. And I don't remember exactly what he said. I was going to read it to you, but that's how it goes. But he said what we all want is humanity, communication, and a lot more. And as we seek to accomplish that, we're helping to knock down barriers that stigma puts in between us. He was talking really about that, about what we all really want. So today we are discussing stigma too often carried by persons with mental illness, developmental disabilities, and substance abuse issues. One aspect of challenging stigma is to reveal reality. Now that's often uncomfortable, as you know. To reduce our discomfort, we may try to camouflage these issues to make them less visible. Less, I like to say, seeable. Seeable means taking it in. So I'd like to move along. We will have discussion until about 11:20, and then we'll take the rest of the time for questions, Q&A. So panel, would you please introduce yourselves and tell us what you do outside of Ebertfest? Would you like to begin, Carolyn?
Am I first?
Or would you like to, Michelle? Sure.
I'll go first. I'm Michell Davis. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so I'm an entertainment attorney. She mentioned intellectual property law, and I guess that's me. Really intellectual property is just dealing with the creative side of law. So it's trademark, copyright, patents, anything that basically you can create. There's a law to help you kind of protect that. So that's what I do in terms of my clients. As far as the Ebertfest, outside of the Ebertfest, that's really what I do. I happen to have just a love for film, and I've been able to, fortunate enough to work in the film industry as an entertainment attorney. So as far as my practice is concerned, I basically represent directors and writers and producers and anybody that'll allow me to, help them out and I get a chance to come to great festivals like this and be very supportive of the filmmaker and all that they're trying to do, and I get a chance to watch film, so that's what I do.
Hi, I'm Patrick Wang, the director of In the Family, and I have no idea what I'm going to do after Ebertfest.
Peripatetic still. Huh?
Still.
Yeah.
I'm Elaine Palencia. I'm an author, and I was writing completely other things, Appalachian literature a lot, because I'm from Kentucky, until our second child was born with severe mental and physical disabilities, as we learned gradually, as he missed developmental markers. And now I find myself also the grandmother of a little boy with autism. So I began to write in essay, in poetry, in fiction about the life that we lead as a family with someone who has been stigmatized every way you can possibly think of in a community like this that is an educated, a relatively educated community of well-meaning people. So that is why I'm on the panel. I'm locally the longtime director of the Red Herring Fiction Workshop, Community Workshop, and I'm also on the Champaign County Developmental Disabilities Board.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Lee, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. Not Yet Begun to Fight is my second documentary film. It's showing on Sunday at noon, and after Ebertfest, I'll be returning to Montana, where I don't know what's next. There's a couple film opportunities on the horizon.
I'm Carolyn Kodes-Atkinson. I presently teach middle school here in Champaign. I originally trained as an actor, but that is not, I am sure, why I'm on this panel. But in teaching middle school, I have the privilege of exposing young people to new ideas and hopefully cultivating in them an excitement not just about my subject area, which happens to be English language arts, but also exciting in them the curiosity about other people, and hopefully cultivating things like compassion, which sometimes I think we do at home, and perhaps some parents do a better job of it than others, but I do think that it's our school's responsibility also to help cultivate tolerance and compassion. And so I think that's why I'm on this panel.
Thank you, Carolyn. We're going to have a discussion. We're not going to have a question and an answer. So I would like Elaine to start out. She wants to frame something. She wants to frame her experience that she wants to tell you about. So Elaine, would you like to start? And then others be prepared, please, to respond to her.
Well, I want to talk in just the broadest possible terms for, 4 to 5 minutes about this subject and art. And since I've been brooding about this, anything I say will take on a lot more weight because of what's been happening in Boston. The history of Western thought is, by and large, the history of dualistic thinking. Civilizationally, societal identity and unity has often been based on dualistic thinking, we versus they. We are who we are because we're not them. In fact, I was told that the word barbarian in ancient Greek originally meant one who does not speak Greek, and therefore his language to a Greek sounds like ba, 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 ba. You see, so that's one way we know that's the other. And the stranger is not to be trusted in those, early tribal ways of looking at things. And it's a survival strategy. Okay, so far so good, maybe, but those dualities over time have been valorized so that East versus West or light versus dark have tied to them good and bad. And this deep civilizational fear of the other sets us up to stigmatize whomever is different from the prevailing definition of the group. Now, not us, but us is a social construct. I'm sorry that so much of Western philosophy said that essence precedes existence, because I don't think it's true. I think identity is relational, so you can't look at somebody and say they're different and because their essence is different from us, and therefore we don't want them in our group. So let's just whip over to entertainment. It's no surprise to any of us that so much of entertainment, as opposed to art, is preoccupied with who the enemy is. You know that from all the cop shows. It's not just a murderer, but it's a serial murderer. And so on. And all of the what I call the blow shit up genre. Where you identify a population, a group, as being different and worse than we are, and then we need to blow them up. And that's what superheroes are for. So who is not like us is demonized. I think that the recent fad in zombie films and certainly in alien invader films are really metaphorizing our fear of other populations that will come and overwhelm our society and change it. And I'm just following the way Stephen King thought about monster movies in Danse Macabre, a nonfiction book he wrote very early about who is the monster, because there were all of the monster movies that came in the 50s when people were afraid of what nuclear war would do. They would produce mutations, they would produce, them and all of those things. So I'm kind of going from that. Okay, but the films for Ebertfest, what Roger did was exactly the opposite. I think over time, over these 15 years, in the films that he has chosen, he says the stranger is like ourselves. We're not surrounded by enemies, And In the Family does this so beautifully. The family, the Southern family, is afraid. This man is not like us. This relationship is not like our relationships. But instead of this being a revenge fantasy, which seems to me every cop show on TV is really a revenge fantasy, not to mention all the Schwarzenegger and Stallone and all of that business, But In the Family comes to a completely different place. Though that family might have fantasies of revenge, they come, all of them, to an accommodation of each other. So, the last thing I will say that we could maybe talk about is one way that real art, as opposed to entertainment or low art, challenges and subverts the prevailing value system is by giving voice and value to marginalized groups. And in doing so, this is really deep into our identities. It challenges, art challenges the notion of identity as well as the notions of aesthetics. So I think that what Patrick is doing and other films in Ebertfest are really capable of changing society itself, how it identifies that hegemonic group. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Would somebody like to respond? You've raised several very good issues and gotten us off to a good start.
Yeah.
I don't see you.
You want a microphone?
One of the things I think that challenges that artists have a challenge with, especially with the viewer, is I think art is individualistic. It's what does it mean to you? And one of the things that I when I talk to people was what is art exactly? What is poetry? How do you define it and things like that? And when you come across a lot of different definitions for certain things and different labels. And I think once you start telling people what this movie is or what it's supposed to be, you take away what that person sees in that film. Good or bad, I mean, for better or for worse. And it kind of sucks when a filmmaker tries to present a certain point of view and somebody takes it completely different. And you know, that's not what I meant to say. But I think we have to take the good with the bad. You know, we have to say, well, that's not what I meant to say at all. You're taking a completely different way, taking this nice thing that I try to, message I try to convey, and twisted it totally around. And I think when people, when we or other people try to say, no, this film says this, and I think it takes away from what art and what writing, what literature, painting, things that we're supposed to be, which is supposed to inspire something in you. And we have to take the good with the bad is what I think.
Thank you, very good comments.
I think there's an interesting point to be made here about art and one of its purposes, which may be to illuminate. But to do that perhaps in some contexts, and it doesn't necessarily have to be so, but this is my choice as a director, to use a relatively light touch so that people can approach what they're seeing with an open heart, so to speak. The Not Yet Begun to Fight is a documentary film about a retired Marine colonel who takes 5 severely wounded veterans and teaches them to fly fish. We made a choice that this film, it's about the impact of war. That's a subject which has the potential to be extremely polarizing and controversial, and we tried to create something that felt very apolitical so that people could approach the characters and what they were experiencing and what their experience is going to be moving forward without judgment. And I think that that's a lot of what you touched on is how do we present this? How do we ignite a discussion, a debate if needed, without making people feel challenged to the point where they feel like they have to defend their ground. And well,
yes. Good. I'm reminded of Emily Dickinson's remark, tell the truth, but tell it slant. So you kind of get it in there, but don't come straight at people, because that's propaganda, really, or often is.
Yeah, it's and I like that spirit of, it's an invitation, and that invitation, I think, helps you access this tremendous resource that sometimes get lost in that fight harder mentality, and that is what people are capable of. And yeah, it's a tremendous untapped resource in the film and in the family. It's this history that people have that they had forgotten they have. When you get into this moment of dispute, you forget the history you have. And I think that if it's strangers for some reason, you forget the commonality you have. And it can be in very small things, but if they're excluded from the conversation, the conversation, I think, suffers. Something so small as, we eat breakfast in the morning, we send our kids to school together. It's amazing how much that small thing can make someone who sees something very foreign at first just stand up and say, that's me, that's my life. And I think that a conversation that includes all those things that seem small in the scale of the weight of the pain and the harshness that people have to deal with. But I think that they have a place in the conversation for helping bring people into the conversation in a complete way.
Well, I think the other point to be emphasized is just access into something that you may not voluntarily enter into. So, the arts just gives us an opportunity to see something different and not be afraid, if you will, to explore and see that there are some commonalities, probably more common than we even care to admit sometimes. You think about your film, Patrick, someone who says, hey, I don't believe in homosexuality or whatever the case may be, or that type of relationship, what you cannot deny is that you believe in family. And although that family structure looks a little bit differently than what your own may look like, you still can't deny having breakfast in the morning, getting your children prepared for school, wanting them to do their best, supporting them, creating opportunities for them to learn. I mean, every family wants that. And so you can't deny that. And I think the arts gives us an opportunity to have those particular elements of love and heart and compassion come out that you wouldn't voluntarily walk yourself into. So access to a community or a type of person or culture that you just wouldn't do on your own. I think the other point I'll say now is just sometimes the folks who are being portrayed, if you will, or the families that might be portrayed, someone said good or bad, or I think the gentleman in the back said, you know, positive or negative. I think, you know, from a African American perspective, there's some things we don't want to see of our culture on television, let's say, because we're afraid people won't accept that. But if it's real and it's, you know, it happens, then why not? Because I think it still gives people an opportunity to learn a little bit more and realize that other folks probably are struggling with the same issues that you have in your own family. And they stand up, like Patrick, saying, hey, you know what, that's me. I can relate to that.
So how do you get people to see what they don't want to see?
I think like with Sabrina's film, I mean, just my own personal opinion on it, I mean, I'm interested in veterans and fly fishing because, one, I'm a veteran. You know, everybody in the film may be someone that doesn't look like me, but I'm fascinated with fly fishing and, you know, I'm a veteran. So actually I would be interested in that, you know, and but there is this whole idea about war, and I'm a veteran, and I'm a war veteran for whatever that's worth, you know, but so I think it's the fact that it deals with something more than, you know, our differences. It deals with what's similar, you know, what's common to us, so.
Well, and if I could, I'd like to speak to a little bit to access and to the Emily Dickinson quote about slant. I do think we owe our kids to give them access to different lifestyles, to different points of view. So many of the kids that I teach come from families that can be sort of insular. We don't talk about what goes on in our family. We don't talk about it outside of our family. If there is something negative about our family or our culture, we certainly don't share it, not at school, perhaps at a family reunion. But I think by exposing kids, by giving them an opportunity to see not only some negative things about their own culture, but other cultures and other people that they wouldn't necessarily come into contact with. And by doing it through art, which gives them an opportunity to process it privately. You know, you're not introducing them to a room full of people in wheelchairs and saying, now what are you going to do? Instead, you give them an opportunity to sit, and I love going to the movies because I love to be able to sit in the dark and process what's going on. If you give them an opportunity to do that and let them do it privately, I think they do come to a place of understanding. They come to care about the people they're watching and recognize that they're just like I am, or just like my friends, or, you know, they find the commonalities and stop focusing on the differences. But I think we owe them that access.
Yeah, there's something that sparked an idea about kids, and I used to teach 5- and 6-year-olds, and what was stunning about them is that they recognize difference, and they would often be the first to say it, but it didn't impact their behavior at all. They don't treat you any differently, they just state it, and there's something, I think, from that, that not hedging around the words, and a forgiveness. We forgive kids for saying that thing that seemed inappropriate at that time because it's a step towards getting to something else. And so I find, like, yeah, observing, especially for, I don't know the other ages that well, but 5 and 6, there's something, I think we have a lot to learn from how they process difference and talk about difference.
Sounds like they're not afraid.
Yeah.
And we become afraid as we grow up. I don't know why. Do you know why? And do you know what you could do to alleviate that somehow?
I mean, I think as a parent myself, I'm constantly aware of what my children are saying and whether or not it's appropriate, and I think that they start to feel the pressure of what is expected of them, and then at the same time they assimilate into that role of distancing themselves from what is different instead of acknowledging it, and you know, being somewhat direct. Something that was interesting, my daughter said to me, "Mommy, why are you always making such films about such depressing subjects? Why can't you make a happy film?" And I said, well, you know, I felt like she was old enough. There's a little bit of language in both of them. Actually, there's a lot of language in my first film because it's about hip-hop musicians in rural America.
I remember that film. Oh, it was good. I saw it here.
And then, but when she watched the film about the wounded veterans, she said, it wasn't as depressing as I thought it was going to be. And I said, well, what made you feel that way? And she said, well, they have hope, so it makes me realize that I can have hope for them too, that I don't have to just feel sorry for them or be afraid for them. And that was a connection made through art that, you know, she might otherwise not have had an opportunity to make until a later age. And so I was somewhat grateful for that moment.
I want to tell you a little story. We've been talking about how you bring people to the stigmatized population and show them we're all alike. But people in some of those stigmatized populations don't see a place for themselves in the main story. So let's look at from that perspective. I want to tell you a little story that happened to my son when he was maybe, 7 years old. And this has to do with the movies. This has to do with E.T. We couldn't take him to the movies because he couldn't ever, I used to imagine that he saw the screen as maybe a wall that moved like a forest. He didn't know there was anything there to look at. But I had a daughter, his sister wanted to go to the movies, so one afternoon it was just an awful day, and E.T. had come to town. And I said, all right, let's just go. And when we would give him food to keep him quiet so we could watch the movie, and we'll just feed him long enough for us to watch the movie. Well, he's sitting there not paying any attention to anything, the credits and everything, and the previews and so on. And you remember how E.T. starts? You see darkness, woods, and some little creature with a red beating heart is running away from something dangerous. All of a sudden, he grabbed me, and I thought, oh my gosh, he's watching. He sees the film, and he began to moan. And I thought, he feels like E.T. He feels like E.T. And so the movie was going on, and he was getting more and more agitated, but in a quiet way, not in a throw your popcorn way, which is what he usually did because he was bored. And so they come in, little Drew Barrymore and her brother, they bring E.T. into the house, and then what are you going to feed him? Well, Andrew, my son, was nonverbal, and teachers had tried to teach him sign, and it wasn't working. Whatever was damaged in the language center wouldn't allow him to learn more than a few signs. But they're there like, oh, do you want something to eat? Do you want something to eat? My son stood up in his seat and did the sign for cracker.
Wow.
And ever since that day, the movies have been a wonderful resource for him. We take him every week to the movies, you see, because he found a story that was his story. As marginalized as he was, he's 35 now, so 28 years ago, he was quite marginalized in society. So the movies can bring everybody in. Art can bring everybody in.
Wow, that's a story that really gets to me.
I know, hard to tell it.
So, yes, yes.
So you guys are talking a lot about this opportunity that people have in the arts, both as audience members and as producers of the arts. I'm an art student here, and a couple of years ago, maybe even last year, I had a professor, Deke Weaver, and he was living in New York during all the 9/11 things that were going on, and he was saying a story about how, as an artist, he was with his friends as well. He was watching the doctors and the nurses and the firemen all being able to involve themselves in helping their community and helping individuals and groups and just like being involved in that kind of like healing process. And as an artist, they kind of felt not necessarily useless for that moment, but that activism was so important in their work because that was how they could contribute in a way that they felt not necessarily equal to these firemen or doctors and nurses, but as important. And we talk a lot about activism in the production of art and if it's necessary. And do you guys feel at all that with this opportunity that artists have and audience members have with film, that artists have a responsibility to use it as activism and not just a film to go see in the theater, but a documentary or a film that can show people that their struggles aren't strictly unique? And is there a responsibility for you guys?
Excellent question. Response.
Yeah, I don't start from that place. I think that every artist has their own path and their own calling. I don't start from that place of what the other person will do, what the other person should know, what the other person will respond. I start from a place of curiosity, what I don't know, and what I find along the way that I think is beautiful and worth reflecting and amplifying in some way. And I think all these other goals for me kind of come out of that particular focus and that drive. But I think it's going to be different for everyone, and I think it's wonderful that it's different for everyone. We need all those different timbres of voice and of activity.
I think it's incumbent upon the artist, just as it is for any member of society, to be honest about what you're doing. And so if that somehow includes what you would call activism, and I guess one of my challenges with this question is because that term can be used rather loosely. So what is activism to one person might just not feel that way to somebody else. A director of photography and an excellent filmmaker who I worked with on my first project used to say, because there were documentary filmmaking, I'm sure like narrative filmmaking, there are numerous moments where you throw your hands up in the air and wonder why you're doing this. And usually you just get blank stares from everybody in the production team, which is not entirely helpful. But at a quiet moment, he put his hand on my arm and he said, "When in doubt, tell the truth." And he meant that on a personal level. And so I think that that's something that is true for all of us.
So your main goals, Patrick, are to tell a story. And
I think for me it's to follow the curiosity. And I feel, and this is one thing I admire about Roger, is just this sense that we have a lot to learn and that we have no idea what is possible. And I remember when I thanked him for how he had championed our film and all the wonderful things he had done, one of the very, I think, enlightening things he said is, he's like, it's not about helping anyone, for him to start with. He just writes what he feels. And I think I feel a little the same way. I start from this feeling and these exercise of empathy, of imagination, and I hope it takes me to a good place. And story emerges from certain things. So even it's a softer approach. It's a more gradual approach. And I think that mirrors what a lot of writers talk about when they talk about story. It's not, maybe when I was younger, it was, you structure it and you have this goal and you have all these things it's that peripatetic, I don't know, fate that I think I pursue in the aesthetics and in the spirit of the piece.
What about those of you who aren't producing the films? Do you feel that sometimes in that kind of, not necessarily films, but art in general, do you feel like you guys have a voice, you should use it?
I'm not sure who you're addressing, but I'd just like to say that I don't think artists have a responsibility to society in maybe the activist way that you're talking about, but I think artists have a responsibility to their art to share it, because it's communication. And in my writing workshop, I'm always saying, if you're just going to write it and put it in a drawer, well, it may help you, but you know, it's not communication exactly. So I think that, you know, the aesthetic responsibility certainly is important.
I would never put responsibility on someone else and tell someone else what it is their responsibility to do. I think those artists, those playwrights, those filmmakers who have chosen to take on as their responsibility the revealing of their own truths or the revealing of points of view that the rest of us may not be aware of, I think they do us a huge service. Can I say that, you know, Law and Order, I don't know, I don't watch Law and Order, but can I say that, you know, they have somehow done something wrong because they haven't taken on that responsibility? No, because I enjoy good entertainment without a message as much as anyone else. But I do think that those artists that choose to do that take on that responsibility, do us a huge service. I mean, I think of all the playwrights at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, all the playwrights that took that on and chose to reveal to the greater world what that really looked like, and how so many people would have been ignorant of that reality without them. They're vital, I think. I don't know that it's every artist's responsibility, but.
Michelle?
Well, I've been debating on whether I was going to say anything to that. I mean, I still line up with everyone else, I guess, and just in terms of the artist telling what their perspective or their truth or their reality is. I think the other part that kind of came to mind is from the business side of things. You know, you don't want folks to be, I don't know, detrimental, so to speak. Like, I'm just thinking, like, if there's a film that's about, you know, that degrades another person or a culture or is a total put down, so to speak, then, you know, I think there's some responsibility even for me as an attorney on saying, well, that's not a film that I can support. You know, maybe then there's some responsibility about what impact that potential film may have. Not so much trying to decide what the content should be, but how it gets to the audience and whether it's going to be detrimental to that audience or how they may respond that causes damage to someone else. Excuse me, damage to someone else. But other than that, I mean, I think we just want them, you know, we want the artists to tell their truth, or how they see it. So.
Yeah, and I think that there's, we haven't talked about the line between when the artist's mission is activism and the work of art turns into something more like propaganda, which is kind of a delicate situation. And for me, I feel like there is a responsibility if what you're creating is art, that there's enough space in it so that people do not feel like they're being confined to the ideas that are being propagated by the film. So, or whatever the work may be.
And I think I would ask this question probably of Patrick and Sabrina as the creative folks, you know, and Elaine, really. As you're getting into the film, you know, and you see it going a certain direction, I mean, which I think is great when you can stay open to it and let the story or follow the curiosity, as Patrick's saying. But what happens when you do get to a point and you start to see where it's going, and how do you keep from making it go a certain way or crossing the line? You know, how do you do that? Or do you? I mean,
Do you have to give it its head and let it go?
well, that's the thing. I mean, I think that's, you know, yes, I think you let characters speak and you let the story develop, but then at some point as the filmmaker, because you are the one that's in control, you know, what do you do in that situation? I'm just curious, you know.
Yeah, you're not really in control. At some point, as the things reveal itself to you, it feels less and less like yours. And I think, what you do is you have to have some compass, you're right. And for me, the compass is just the things you fall in love with. And that becomes your measure. You can't hurt your film at a certain point. And so that's how you make your decisions. And things become clear. Things are hard, you know. They're inconvenient decisions you'll have to make at times, and There's rare, wonderful things you're going to put up there that you know are basically big targets for misinterpretation and other things, but it's what you fall in love with. And so at some points, it feels like you have no choice. Yeah.
Interesting.
I think that's a
Oh, wait a
beautiful,
minute.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, please.
Elaine,
If
go
you have-
ahead.
if you wanna
I
elaborate.
didn't see you
I can
standing
wait.
there, I'm
No, I can
sorry.
wait.
I just was going to say, I like that talk about following the positive, because in the fiction workshop that I direct, when people come in with a lot of anger and write out of that anger, and that's what they want to get on the page, it's almost never successful as a piece of art or even as communication, because it doesn't allow those spaces. So I think a lot of times we might start, especially talking about stigma, out of a place of anger, but you have to find a way to change that into, or find the compassion in the situation, or you're not going to get anybody paying any attention to you, for one thing, and you
Yeah.
damage your art.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think enabling someone to empathize or identify with someone else is the great gift of art. I mean, E.T., I think that's still Spielberg's best film, in my personal opinion. But I'm so glad Sabrina mentioned space, because that's kind of what I wanted to build on, was there are certain films that have great intentions, that have a great message about tolerance, but I feel like some audiences will just check out of it when they feel they're sliding into that formula. And what's so beautiful about Patrick's film I saw for the first time last night, there's not a dull moment in all 3 hours of it, is he takes so much, there's so much in that film that is apart from the basic hitting all the story beats and hitting all the points. And you're really getting a sense of who these people are as people and not as symbols. They don't feel like symbols. And I feel like the more an audience feels like, I know this person. I mean, was that a conscious decision on your part? Or is that, again, just kind of following what felt right? Because I feel like I can't imagine the story working any other way. I feel like that you'll just feel like you're being preached at, but it just unfolded beautifully.
Thank you. It's somewhat the pattern of what we're talking about stigma, in that it's a difference. You know, what you described, these are elements of the storytelling that, to me, felt different. And they're the things I was talking about in terms of putting a target on it, and you worry about it. And there's a part of you that wants to tuck it back in and make it a little more like everything else and a little easier. But then you learn to appreciate its difference. And its difference is an opportunity, like you said, to feel these things. And I love that discussion about space. I don't know what I was thinking going in and making it, but as I've watched it with people, I have learned that space for someone to feel their own personal, form their personal opinions, but also if there's a particular theme of a father, a brother, someone, for them to remember their own families, it gives it a very personal space, and it's part of that idea of invitation that I've learned since, I've watched this film with audiences, is essential for a particular kind of film. Yeah. And it helps that connection, personal connection.
I want to ask Patrick if he gave, or if it's just my impression, any thought to the portrayal of the two mothers that are in your film. The mother of the family that has taken the child away, and then during the deposition, the way the character talks about his mother. Because we've had a very good example today of someone being the primary teacher of stigma is the family, and where it is transcribed through, I'll just say I'm Irish. Does that give you any idea of what goes on in our stories sometimes at home? Some of them are 600 years old. You remember when, this kind of thing, and that kind of thing. But how important, you say curiosity, and I was so confused, and still am, by the mother of the family that took this child, and then later on in the movie, she is the first one that deals with your anger and your and what has actually happened. And it's supposed to be very strong, and I'm going, didn't work for me. So I just would like your comment about that.
Thank you. I'll talk a little bit about that shift for Eileen, but I don't want to say too much, because I think one of the really lovely things is that you get to think about what is going through her head and what she is experiencing. But I think that when you have the center of a family who is so loved, as Cody is loved, gone all of a sudden, there's this big hole, and everybody's trying to find some grounding, you know, when there's this loss. And it's hard. And you hold on to, it distorts parts of you, you know, that want to hold on to a certain thing, that are trying to deal with a certain type of grief. It distorts relationships. And I think that that's the setting for all the things she's thinking, to the mourning she's doing for her brother. There's another mother, which is her mother, Cody's mother, who, it breaks my heart in the movie, because you look at it, she has lost her daughter-in-law, she's lost her son, and it's not spoken, but she's lost her husband in this time, very short period of time. And if there's anyone that can help her deal with loss, it's Joey. And that opportunity is lost because of this other stuff that comes between them, and so they can't be that for each other. And I think that that is a sense of regret I have when I hear stories, you know, of stigma and all these other things. It's just this separation. There's this huge potential for help that we can be to each other, and healing that we can be to each other, that I think is lost. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.
Many portrayals of people with disabilities in movies and TV often seem to be one of polar opposites, either a stigma, a negative portrayal, but there's also a strain of what I would call kind of highly romanticizing the other. Think about movies like King of Hearts in the 70s, where people in a mental institution who are released and they're happy-go-lucky and very childlike, and other movies that have portrayed people with various mental disabilities as very childlike. And what are the challenges, and what are the approaches to show more nuance for people with disabilities? Showing them in a more human light without being preachy and overly sentimental.
Mm-hmm. Very good question.
I think I can speak to that. When the idea was born to make Not Yet Begun to Fight, and we had very little time in pre-production, because the veterans who come to Montana they come right out of the hospital, and so we didn't have even their names until the day we started shooting, so there was no pre-interview, there was no opportunity to get to know them, have a sense of what their character arc might be. And I think my co-director and I, to some degree, thought, well, this is going to be a fairly monochromatic group. They're relatively the same age, they've been through the same experience, and they're all badly injured, either emotionally or physically, or in most cases both. And what we found was, it could not have been farther from the truth, of course. Good lesson there. And I think that, you know, to your point, there is an obligation to allow people to see that this is like any group of, you know, section of the population, that there's diversity, there's a difference in point of view. I mean, to answer your question about how do you address that? I mean, I think that it's just maybe in Patrick's experience making a film, which was a narrative film, but also being somewhat open to what the possibilities are, not having a specific outcome in mind, but allowing himself to be responsive to what was happening as the film was being made, and allowing the opportunity to show some of that texture that maybe we don't see in a lot of narrative films when we go to the movies. So I think that's a valid point. There's a stereotype there for sure.
Well, we're so used to telling the story for these people, you know, we might ask them I mean, I think you need more people from these marginalized groups telling their own stories, and it certainly is happening with your film, I believe.
We've been talking primarily about film, and that's understandable. I'm wondering about the performing arts and what role any of them, say dance, might have in breaking down stigma.
I was previously a professional modern dancer and performance artist. That's how that was my artistic form for most of my 20s until my body simply wouldn't take it anymore. So I chose something that was a little bit gentler on my facility. But I think that, in modern dance particularly, there's a great opportunity because you can, in a somewhat abstract way, represent those kinds of issues and then back to that issue of space, you're doing it in such a way because although there might be a specific theme that audiences are supposed to identify with or a narrative thread, there's a lot more openness to interpretation. And I think that, clearly it depends upon the choreographer and their point of view, but I remember one of my favorite pieces that I ever participated in, and it was about the Holocaust. It was a 90-minute long piece that performed around the country, and I loved the set. There was no set except there was barbed wire strung between the audience and the dancers. We were within the concentration camp, and I had this solo, which was one of the most. It was quite ugly to watch. I watched the video and I feel badly that I made people sit through it. But the choreographer had such a brilliant idea, and she had used the idea of the extinction of dinosaurs to what was being done to the Jews, essentially. And so I was bound in ace bandages, and I had what appeared to be an injured arm, and the dance, which was kind of a slow death, was supposed to be representative of what the Nazis were trying to impose upon the Jews. And I feel like that connection, being able to show the physical decline of a creature, allowed people to view that from kind of a different vantage point than maybe they might have previously through literature or through film. There was an opportunity to really see it in a different light. So, sorry that was so long-winded.
Interesting, yeah.
I can't speak to dance, but I can speak to spoken word poetry. I had the opportunity to expose my students to Louder Than a Bomb, which is a documentary that was here last year? Was it 2 years ago? And just not only were they moved by the stories, that it's a documentary about 4 different high schools in Chicago that are participating in a slam poetry competition citywide. And it sort of profiles some of the students and the schools they come from. And not only was it an opportunity for my students to see a different way of expression, the whole idea of spoken word poetry really changed for them not only their concept of poetry, but also their concept of self-expression. How can I tell my story? What do I have to say? And how can I say it? But also, in the film, one of the young women talks about her brother, who was developmentally disabled, and talks about him. Her previous poetry had been about her father, which was full of anger and frustration, and her poetry about her brother was full of such love and such care and such compassion. And you could just see these middle school kids don't want to be different. They want to be exactly the same as one another. As much as they want to be individuals, they really want to blend. And they certainly don't want to show weakness or compassion or caring. It's in middle school, you just have to be tough. And you could just see the impact on these students, not only just seeing one of their own being able to be so open to this. And it had a huge impact on them. So certainly I think that something other than film, spoken word poetry really was able to open doors for them emotionally.
Thank you. You can, sure, Julian.
To quote Stephen Sondheim, art isn't easy. And, you know, whether if it's just simple poetry, there's still time involved and a couple of materials. When you reach to the higher levels of film or theater or, you know, sculptures and things where materials are more expensive, it's hard to distribute that, to get an audience, to make it effective. So, for an example, George Lucas spent $125 million on Red Tail, which told the stories of the airmen during the African American airmen during World War II. And he was told by every studio, this is George Lucas, every studio, we're not going to get it made, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to put a dollar towards it, because there's no foreign market for it at all, because it stars African American actors. It's an African American story. So, in that sense, for any art form, how do you get it seen? How do you get it made in the first place and then seen?
Excellent question. I don't think anyone has the answer. I think that this is maybe in line with what we've been talking about, is for me, the seed is it worth it? And the answer is yes, and so then you do whatever comes to mind, and you look for whoever is going to help you with the rock, pushing it up, and yeah, it's hard. But I'm going to put forth a different theory of what the distinction you made between film and these other performing arts, which I've learned since I've made this movie, is I think film in a movie theater is a performing art. And there are all the patterns of live theater that I've felt as I've worked in theater, in film as a performing art. And so to me, it's just, that's the first thing, is remember it's worthwhile, feel how worthwhile it is, be in the theater with the people, be in with your audience, and then, you know, some of it is, I think the most powerful tool we've had is time. We wear people down. We'll call the theater and we'll call the theater and they get sick of us and finally, yes, we'll play your movie. But you do whatever it takes and the opportunities keep shifting. And, but yeah, you just remember it's worthwhile and you keep going.
I was just going to say that I think it's, I mean, many artists might have different points of view, but I think it goes also back to not being attached to the outcome, just being willing to follow the story as it emerges and not deciding up front that this is going to be a film that's loved by millions, but perhaps it's just something that is a reflection of the subject, and that's what legitimizes it, and not the fact that it becomes part of popular culture necessarily.
And that's really difficult to do. I mean, from the business side of it, yeah. You know, when I'm, you know, trying to represent an investor, the investor wants to see how they're going to get their money back. It's like Ann Hubble was saying on the last panel, you know, she's got a film and it stars, you know, Academy Award nominees that happen to be African American, and it's like, well, there's no foreign market for it, because that's the way the financial structure is set up for these films. But you just have to keep looking for that group or that person or that studio or that executive who finally gets it. You know, when you think about a film like Beasts of the Southern Wild, you know, it clearly stars African American, you know, father and daughter and much of the cast, but it was never really portrayed in that way, which also said that much of the black audience had not seen the film and was not aware of the film initially. I mean, because it came out of Sundance, it got a lot of critical acclaim. The audience was not black. And I know they fought very hard in terms of how it would be marketed to make sure that it was not necessarily portrayed as, say, a black film, because there's a stigma. Let's just be honest about it. So, I mean, I think you just find the right people who say, okay, I get it, and understand that, you know, we're more alike than we are different, and there's something to be learned from the film. So it's hard. Maybe we do fly fishing or something, and it just happened to be, they just happen to be black. I don't know. I'm just, you know, I don't mean it in that way, but just saying, you just have to tell the story, and then hope that you can find the right people to help you get it to the widest audience possible.
There's also, I had a friend who was running for office at one point, and she was having a very hard time of it with the people around her. And I tried to remember the advice I gave her at the time, which was, if it were, you know, if it were easy, they wouldn't need you. And it's one of those things, if the wheels of commerce were greased for it, it would be fine without you. But these other things need you. They need you to help them along. And I think that is, yeah, that keeps me going. Even if you find other people, wonderful, but even when you don't, yeah, then you realize, yeah, you got to get out of the mentality of two people show up, and the first feeling is going to, for screening, and the first feeling is major disappointment. But then you got to remind yourself, what kind of person have I become when I dismiss two people and their experiences with this film? And so, yeah, you have to keep reminding yourself, it's so common to go to these measures and these forms of convenience and to say, no, look at it. Look at what matters here and what is worthwhile here and what's worth and what needs me here.
Was your friend elected?
Not yet.
I found it very poignant yesterday to be watching the film about Van Gogh. There we sat, hundreds of us, appreciating him now, you know, but the life he led. And those letters say, you know, it's really about the art. It's about the art. It's about the vision. It's about his responsibility to do the paintings. And boy, he didn't sell out, did he? But he suffered.
Julian.
Yes. This is, of course, you're not a random group of artists, and this festival, in a sense, is also not random, right? There's a sensibility, and so what I'm thinking here, I'm a social scientist. I'm not an artist, and I've heard this conversation that you're having now in my discipline too, in which it's very, so I want to throw, it's a little bit of a challenge, although I feel bizarre challenging you all because I'm nothing but, if not overwhelmed by what I see here every year, and this year for sure. But the idea that the artist's responsibility is just to seek their truth troubles me in this way. I've heard that exact argument in the social sciences when they're challenged to open up and be more broad in their perspective. And there's a long tradition in every one of the social sciences of what appeared to be nothing but the search for truth, which turned out to be incredibly harmful. You know, it would be easy to think up examples also from the arts. I mean, you know, was Birth of a Nation a great movie? At any rate, what I'm going to say is, isn't it reasonable for people, for you yourselves, and for people to ask artists to not simply think that the only way to pursue your art is what your own personal truth is, because there will be other people, and maybe more than you, who will have personal truths that may be so socially harmful. So isn't there some responsibility for the arts community to challenge that as well? And I know you do personally, but I'm thinking it now more as a sense of what the disciplines are about.
Yeah, I feel like as an artist and as a person, your only option is to use the lens that you have, which is yourself. So I'm certainly not trying to make the case that my truth is somehow the larger truth. it's informed by all of my experiences, which relate to this world and the people in it. So, in fact, what I've tried to do with both of my films is have the point of view feel. Again, it's that idea of a light touch, because I'm trying to open the door for a discussion about what the larger truth might be. I still have to make decisions about what questions to ask my subjects and where to point the camera, but and how to cut the film ultimately. But beyond that, it's my way. It's my approach to do that in as generous a way as possible, really. So I mean, I think we're deceiving ourselves if we can say that somehow because we're artists, we have greater contact or a greater understanding of what the larger truth is. You know, if the best that we can do is reflect the way that we see the world and do it in such a way that it invites conversation about it, I think that's ultimately a good thing. I don't know, does that kind of address what you're saying, or?
Take it however you like. I was interested in your views about activism within your own arts community.
Uh-huh.
To create more of what you do. Because saying that if you leave it at its artist's only responsibility is to pursue their own truth, it seems to me there's this empty place in terms of the wider discipline.
Well, were you here at the beginning? Because the way this is framed is in terms of subverting the prevailing, art subverting the prevailing value system. And in that way, it's not art for art's sake. I mean, the Parnassians in France didn't get very far with art for art's sake, you know. The people who wrote, there was a group of them that wrote a book that all the words started with the letter T because that was an interesting thing to do in art, you know. So art, I think we've been talking about art for the whole conversation as democratizing and subverting because it brings voices in that weren't there. And maybe we are self-selected, these artists, to be the people who hear those other voices and bring them in.
Well, it's interesting to me, we've been talking about the arts and so on. I think of music as one of the arts. And yet, I have yet to hear somebody even mention music this morning. Would anybody like to respond to that? Tell me why that is.
I mean, for me, I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, when we started shifting the conversation to dance, it's the same shape of things.
Yes,
The particulars of the industry will sound a little different, but I think as far as where we're coming from and the things we value and the challenges that are faced, to me it feels the same. And it feels the same across, like this gentleman said, across whether you're an artist in name or an artist in hiding under a different name. You see these same patterns too.
Any other comments? Yes.
I just wanted to say in Patrick's film, one of the key elements in connecting between the people was music, between the two lead characters. So that was very nice because that's one thing most of us share in common, is a love for music.
Thank you. Any other comments? Sure.
Sorry, I'm a big fan of the mic. Just a really quick comment on music. In my program, we talk about it a lot, where if a student puts music in their film, you don't really get in trouble. You don't really get in trouble for anything. But it's, in a way, it's just a little bit more manipulative than watching or walking through an experience in the arts, because you can't, for the most part, you can't avoid it. The vibrations, you either hear them or you feel them, and they're there. You can't get away from it. So in that sense, I think you can talk about it in terms of art, but at the same time, you can't avoid it in any subject matter, because once the music's on, it's there, and it affects you.
Interesting that you use the word manipulative. what it kind of brought to mind is like if you're, maybe it makes you change your perspective a little bit about what you're actually seeing. I mean, if you think about a film and then it has like, I know you're younger, but, R&B from the 1960s or whatever, and it's music that everybody knows and can sing, and you hear that in the background, of a film, does that change what you see or what your perspective might be about what you see? And like you said, once the music's on, then it kind of changes, what do? You can't unhear it. So I don't know, it's just interesting that you use that word manipulative. In Patrick's film, he uses music, and then you hear the lyrics of what the music is saying or whatever, and like, does that change how you feel about the characters, Yeah. And I think maybe it does.
But it also opens you up, because if you've got your guards up and already have determined what you're going to see and what your judgment on it, you hear something familiar, something that you like, it quiets you down a little bit and opens you up so you can listen to it.
I'm gonna just one more point
We
on
do have time,
because
yeah.
because we're talking about Louder Than a Bomb and spoken word, but how do people feel about hip hop or rap music, where spoken word is really like rap music without the music? So it's like,
Yes, it is.
or like Sabrina's other film, which I just thought was fascinating because it was people that you wouldn't think to be rappers, but were. The guy who's living at home with his mother, and she's paying for him to go to these slam competitions or whatever it is, or challenge competitions, and you're like, really? Does that really exist? But so it just challenges you, even though a lot of folks would say, I don't like rap music, so, and I'm one of them, but anyway.
I think that's a good comment to end on. I think it's time. Shall we?
Oh, no, that's okay.